Alright, so now we're going to talk about using hints in the MongoDB Node.js driver. So before we do that, we're actually going to cover using explain in the driver. So this is a way to get information about what index we used and information about our query and the performance of the query. So let's take a look at an example. Alright, so this is our example of using explain in the MongoDB Node.js driver. So what we have here is we have a find query looking for x equals 2, and we're making a cursor out of that, and then we're calling cursor.explain. So you remember that we would call cursor.each, cursor.toArray, and then we'd get our documents back. Instead we're doing cursor.explain. So remember that this line doesn't actually run the query. This line just sort of builds our cursor object, which describes what our query is. This line is actually running our query, and we're choosing to run it in the explain mode. So note that after this we can't actually do cursor.each, we can't actually do cursor.toArray because we've already run the query. So doing the explain actually runs the query because it really has to run it in order to get the actual statistics about how the query was run. So it takes one callback, which gets an error object and the explain output. So all we do in this function is we just log the explain output and then close the database connection. Alright, so let's run our example using explain and querying on x equals 2. Alright, so this is our output of our application. Notice we get a document back, but this is not a document that is actually in our database. This is a document describing how the query was run. And we can see up here that the cursor we used is btree cursor x_1. So before this video I inserted a few documents and I actually made an index on x. So this says that we used our index on x, and then this 1 specifies the sort order. So this was actually a really good query because n, which is the number of documents that we actually got as the result of our query, is equal to nscanned objects and nscanned, which is just the number of documents and index entries we actually had to look at. So down here we see some other statistics about our query, but for now let's ignore that and move on to hinting in the Node.js MongoDB driver. So let's go back to our example. Alright, so here's our example again. So I'm going to change a little bit. I'm going to actually add some more parameters to find, and then we'll discuss that. Alright. So I added 2 more parameters to find here. I actually added a empty projection operator, so we don't actually want to project our documents. And then I added this options object. And in the options object I added a hint, and the hint value is $natural:1. So what this is saying is, for this query, our hint is that we want to not use an index. $natural is actually a special keyword. It just says don't use an index for this query. So this will actually construct our cursor, and then when we call .explain, it's going to be called with these options, and we should see a difference in our explain output. So let's actually run this and see what we get. Alright, so we're running our application with our hint to not use an index. So let's see what that looks like. Alright, so down here we have our explain output, and we can see that the cursor changed. So instead of what we saw before, which was the btree cursor on x, we actually see we're using a basic cursor. So this is just the name for a cursor that scans the entire collection and looks at every document. So down here we can see that n is 1, so our result set is still the same. We still get 1 document back. 1 document matches x equals 2, but we actually see that we have an increase in the number of scanned objects and nscanned. So we only actually have 6 documents in this collection, so we actually had to look at every single document before we could actually return the result of our query. Alright, so MongoDB actually listened to our hint, and that's good for not using an index at all, but let's actually talk about using a different index. Alright, so I'm going to change this a little bit so we can use a different index. Alright, so here I changed the $natural to _ID. So this is just saying if there's an index on _ID, use that for this query. So you could put anything here. You could put y, z. If you have an index on y or z, MongoDB will use that instead of trying to determine which index to use itself. So let's run this and actually see what results we get. Alright, so this is hinting to use the underscore ID index. So we have some interesting results here. So like the first query we ran, we see we're using a B-tree cursor. We're actually using a B-tree cursor on underscore ID. So MongoDB listened to our hint, which is great, but we have kind of a problem here. So here we have n is 1, so our result set is 1, as always. But down here we actually have nscanned and nscanned object is 6, just like when we weren't using any index at all. So because our query had nothing to do with underscore ID, scanning it doesn't help us at all. The speed of an index lies in its ability to rule out ranges of documents. And if we're using an index on underscore ID and looking for a document that matches x equals 2, we can't actually rule out anything, and we still have to look at every single document. So this is actually even worse in some ways than the $natural, because we not only have to read all these documents, but we actually have to bring in the underscore ID index and scan the entire index. So there's even an added layer of overhead there. So this is just an example of why you need to be careful when using the hint, and why you need to really understand when a query can efficiently use an index, because otherwise you'll get in this situation where you're trying to use an index and MongoDB faithfully listens but performs a very inefficient query. So this example seems very simple because we're querying on X and we're looking at underscore ID. It's intuitive that we can't really use this index. There may be situations where intuitively you think an index would work well for a query, but because of the way indexes are structured and because of the way they're laid out, it might not actually be very efficient. So it's important to be very aware if you're hinting exactly how indexes work and whether it will actually be faster. And I would actually recommend, if you're planning on using a hint in an application, to just run explain to make sure that the query is actually faster by looking at n and nscanned. Alright, so that's hinting and explain in the MongoDB Node.js driver.